So my name is Mylène Rattel. I will be the chair for this session. Mainly being a chair, I have two roles: to introduce the speaker as well as to track time. We are 6 speakers of 10 minutes, and we have also five 2-minute lightning talk. I will not stop you exactly at the 10 minutes mark, but I will take the time, and if needed, unfortunately, I will stop your presentation. So this is the human dimension impact and management session. I don't think we will have time for questions between each presentation. So each presentation will be 8 to 10 minutes. So I will invite you to contact directly the speaker and attend poster presentation at the end later in this conference to have the chance to engage with speakers. I'm sorry in advance if I mispronounce names. Feel free to correct me and to introduce yourself. For our speakers today, I would invite you to prepare your presentation and to be ready to share it. So in Zoom, if you're not familiar, you have a share button. So I'll be prepared, please. So I think we are on time, so I will start with the presentation. Myself, I'm the first speaker. I am a research scientist and an adjoint professor at University of Waterloo in the School of Public Health Systems, Science. I will move that. So, and I will time myself. Great. So the project that I will introduce you today is a multidisciplinary project. So on drinking water perception and consumption in subarctic indigenous communities of the Northwest Territories and Yukon. We have many collaborators, so we are a team in public health, but it is really a multidisciplinary study. So we have like several collaborators around Canada. So these are some of those collaborators. The project started in 2015 through an initiative funded by the Northern Contaminant Program. PI is Brian Laird. And we aimed to measure contaminant and nutrient level in people via mainly biomonitoring and surveys, and to identify exposure factors, including wild food, traditional food. Through the consultation process and engagement activity and the communication in general, we heard people had a very strong interest to put water at the core of projects. There was like a strong interest in investigating water, talking about water, knowing more about water. So that was like a strong priority for the 10 communities that take part in the biomonitoring project. We used food surveys, so a food frequency questionnaire, a 24-hour recall questionnaire. We had also other surveys, and we documented demographic and lifestyle, other targeted exposure factors, risk perception and communication. And we collected hair, blood, urine to quantify contaminant and nutrient markers. Overall, we invited people in 10 communities to participate in this project, and we have about 614 persons that took part in 3 different regions of the north, so the Deschaux, the Satu regions, and Okro. We documented the consumption of drinking water as well as the perception. The consumption through surveys, so findings were that there was like a low consumption of water. So 1% on 5 did not consume water in the previous 24 hours. That includes tea and coffee. And the average of those plain water, tea, coffee was less than 1 liter a day. That third of the respondents drank more bottled water than tap water. And 40% of respondents drank more tea and coffee than plain water. A lot of people, including myself, occasionally, we add sugar in our tea and coffee. So in average, drinking tea and coffee for those respondents, resulting in adding 100 grams of added sugar per day. Tap water was still the main source of drinking water for the 2/3 of respondents in the Northwest Territory and 87% in the Yukon. There is an importance of lake and river for drinking water. So between 2 to 5%, according to the region, consume water from the land, so from water bodies directly in the previous 24 hours. 65%, so the 2/3 of respondents consume occasionally untreated water. So we also had like a small component investigating the perception of water. So chlorine smell, chlorine taste was the reported factor for not drinking more water, more tap water. And there were concerns about chlorine in water as a contaminant. We also found that participants who had this concern about chlorine tend statistically to drink more water from the land, so untreated water. Comments that worth mentioning here with this water community. So we received comments to test more lakes for contaminants, and that people had concerns on contaminants due to thawing of permafrost, flooding, change in water levels. So there are clear limitations of doing surveys. So we wanted to know more of the reason of this perception and low consumption of water. So we participated in a cross-cultural water camp in the Satu. So PIs on this project are Jennifer Balzer from Laurier University and Leon Andrew from the Satu Renewable Resource Board. So we took part in this camp. We were invited to spend 1 week with community members and some researchers. In total, were about 40. And the aim is to network, to discuss priorities, to share knowledge. This part of the project is funded by the Global Water Futures. In this water camp, we organized a 1-hour focus group. So we took this opportunity to structure a discussion regarding drinking water. From this discussion, 4 main thematic elements were discussed. First, that Indigenous knowledge might impact both the perception and consumption of water. So we heard that that when the participants were younger, they were told by parents not to drink plain water, but instead to drink broth and tea. So as a public health scientist, it's easy to think, okay, we limit, we boil water, so we limit microorganism exposure. The second key element was a preference to drink untreated water. By example, participant reporting preferring to drink tea made with snow instead of tap water, by example. They were talking about a gray layer on top of the tea that was not there when the tea was prepared with snow. So we think about hardness and water that can result in this layer on the tea. We heard also about, again, the strong chlorine taste, preventing people from drinking tap water. So a strong chlorine odor might be related to byproduct of chlorine. That is in a relation with organic matter in the water. So key element number 2 and 3 might be able to, we might be able to control those by additional filter directly on the tap or at the water plant. So I'm just like putting this out there if there is some technology scientist attending this session. And the fourth element was limited knowledge regarding a house water tank. So people did not know when or how to clean the water tank because, well, water is delivered to each of the house by a truck. So there is like an opportunity there to facilitate knowledge exchange. So in conclusion, well, because of historical background, because of still current issue with drinking water in the north, people have low trust in their water. And the low consumption of water has an impact on diet and public health. So you think about alternative of drinking water, so mainly pups, juice, added sugar in tea and coffee. And it's very important to continue this collaboration to rebuild trust with people living in the north and indigenous community. So I will take this opportunity to introduce the next speaker. She is a PhD candidate at University of Waterloo, and her project is investigating the relationship between wild food and environment contaminant exposure in Yukon. So Mallory Drysdale, please, can you share your screen?
Sure, just let me. Can you see that, Milan?
Yes, that's all good.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Mallory Drysdale, as Milan said. I'm a fourth-year PhD student. My supervisor is Dr. Brian Laird at the University of Waterloo. I also work with Milan, so this is very handy for my presentation because she provided a lot of the background information for me. So I'll be presenting on determinants of exposure for 4 different contaminants and nutrients: lead, cobalt, manganese, and hexachlorobenzene in northern Canada. So Milan provided a lot of information, but as a short recap, our research group ran several human biomonitoring clinics across 3 years. These clinics included 600 participants from communities in the Dehcho and Sachu regions of the Northwest Territories, as well as in Old Crow in the Yukon. In each place, community members had the option of giving blood, hair, and urine, which were tested for contaminant and nutrient concentrations. And they were also given surveys asking about traditional foods. And in the Yukon, we had an additional survey asking people about lifestyle risk factors for contaminant exposure. So things like smoking and using lead ammunition for hunting wild food. So as part of the results of this project, we identified contaminants and nutrient levels in bodies that are different in these communities than in the general Canadian population in the South. So this project was looking at a few of the ones that we identified that were higher in these areas than they were in Southern Canada. And these included lead, which is a toxic metal, cobalt and manganese, and these are metal nutrients, but they can also cause toxic effects at high concentrations. And lastly, we have hexachlorobenzene, which I'll call HCB. It's a type of pesticide that's persistent in the environment and in people. So it's still found all over the world, including in the Arctic, despite no longer being in use. In the majority of these cases, cobalt, manganese, and HCB, there is no health threshold, like threshold for health effects. And in the case of lead, 95% of the participants were below the threshold at which health effects can be seen. So the purpose of my work is to identify potential factors or determinants that are associated with higher levels of these 4 contaminants. I used a regression model where the outcome is the level of the contaminant in people's blood or urine, and then I adjusted these levels to age and sex because those can have a strong effects on the levels of these contaminants in our bodies. So for each model, I put in one determinant that I wanted to measure. So this would include things like whether or not the person eats a certain food, like local fish, or has another risk factor, like drinking untreated water from the local river or smoking. And the model gives us a % difference in the blood or urine levels of the contaminant for those who do have the risk factor or the determinant and those who don't. So what does that look like? Here's a typical result table for one of the determinants that I looked at, eating the organs of locally hunted animals. My little stars here show which numbers are statistically significant, and the numbers are the % difference in blood or urine levels for people who eat the organs versus those who don't. We didn't see any relationships between manganese or cobalt levels, so these were not included in this slide. We see that average lead and HCB levels are higher in people who eat certain moose and caribou organs than those who don't. So both lead and HCB can accumulate in certain organs and might be possible sources of these contaminants in people's bodies. For instance, HCB is lipophilic, it accumulates in fatty tissue. So you can see here that there are relationships between HCB exposure and consumption of some fatty tissue in caribou and moose. To complement this work, we took samples of organs from local moose and caribou in Old Crow, and we found that the levels of HCB in caribou tissue were higher than in typical market meats, but similar to caribou in other Arctic regions. So things like this might explain why we are seeing higher levels of things like HCB in Arctic regions than in the South. We also saw a relationship between smoking and higher lead levels. This is supported by the literature, which shows that smoking cigarettes can increase the amount of lead in your body, and it's likely related to the presence of lead in cigarettes. We also had a few items that were only analyzed in the community of Old Crow in the Yukon. So for instance, we found that people who took a daily multivitamin had higher average cobalt levels, which could be attributed to the presence of vitamin B12, which contains cobalt in multivitamins. And people who took, there was no relationship between using lead-bearing ammunition and lead levels in people's bodies, but food sharing in the community meant that many people did not actually know what kind of ammunition was used for the food that they were eating. So we're not really sure about the lack of association there. Lastly, and Milan kind of alluded to this, we saw higher manganese lead levels in people who drink untreated river water. This is a relatively common practice while harvesting traditional foods. In Old Crow, the Porcupine River runs through the community. The porcupine is sampled seasonally and analyzed for a full suite of metals. Sometimes it is sampled monthly. Generally, the levels of all metals, including manganese and lead, are within drinking water guidelines. However, levels of both manganese and lead were above guidelines during several of the most recent spring freshets within the most recent 5 years of sampling. So this could be a possible source of lead and manganese exposure for those who are drinking that untreated water. So what is next for this work? First, I've been returning these results to participating communities, and we have an ongoing dialogue with them and with the regional health units. When I returned the biomonitoring clinic results to Old Crow and I told people about which contaminants and nutrients were higher in Old Crow than in the South, people were really interested in the why. So this project is how we start to answer that. It can prompt things like the sampling program that I mentioned above for HCB and more detailed work on specific items. So to that end, there are a few projects happening right now, and one is a lead exposure study in the Sati region, which is being presented on a poster by Colleen Lazarescu. Sarah Paco McCormick is presenting a poster on mercury exposure and bioaccessibility in the Northwest Territories during this conference as well. And I'm also finishing up some more detailed work on HCV exposure from traditional foods in Old Crow to see if we can quantify the level of exposure and identify possible sources. So thank you very much. I guess questions are at the end, Milen?
Yes, Mallory, we will
Okay,
wait
thank
at
you
the
so
end
much.
if we still have time. Thank you very much for this presentation. Our next speaker is Kurt Belcher. He is a graduate student at University of Saskatchewan. His work focuses on the agent-based modeling. Kurt, could you please share your screen?
Yep, thank you. Is that working?
Yes, that's great.
Hi, my name's Kurt Belcher, and I'm a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan. This is my presentation, First Nations-led mental health recovery in the face of environmental jeopardy, covering some early results from my thesis project about the factors involved in positive mental health outcomes after the extensive flooding that is experienced by some First Nations communities in Saskatchewan. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I live and work is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of Cree peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Because of factors like community placement, lack of proper funding, and poor environmental management from external organizations or individuals, First Nations communities in the Canadian prairies are more vulnerable to physical, mental, and social health effects caused by climate and weather events, including incremental climate changes. The issues these communities face need to be addressed in ways that center First Nations to best meet First Nations interests. The experiences of 2 First Nations communities in rural Saskatchewan shape this research to better understand flooding and mental health effects of flooding in these communities. Yellowquill First Nation and James Smith Cree Nation, the partners in this research, are reserve communities located in Treaty Areas 4 and 6 respectively. These communities have a long history of flooding and experience spring flooding on an almost yearly basis. The worst floods at James Smith occurred from 2012 to 2016, with evacuations during 2014 and 2015. And the most serious events at Yellowquill occurred from 2005 to 2007, with an evacuation occurring in 2007. Extreme weather and climate disasters like flooding are becoming more common due to climate change, and many of these disasters and events have massive public health consequences. Flooding often results in injury, disease, and death, but also mental health consequences like PTSD, depression, and anxiety. More indirect mental health effects of flooding are difficult to attribute to disasters or weather events. Correlated mental health issues like suicidal ideation, behavioral problems, and domestic violence increase after disasters, but the indirect connection these effects have make them difficult to definitively attribute to acute or incremental climate events. Marginalized communities like First Nations reserves often have limited access to healthcare services, unstable access to food and clean water if those services are disrupted by disaster, and they often face discrimination in accessing health services. These issues of marginalization can limit the opportunity for good recovery outcomes after a flood disaster. Colonial structures also continue to affect mental health outcomes with a prevailing ignorance of the First Nations perspectives of health, including spirituality, tradition, and connection to nature. When researching flooding and mental health, then, taking First Nations methods, concerns, and knowledge into account when examining mental health on reserves is extremely important to the context as well as the outcomes of health adaptation. Decolonizing the process of recovery for a First Nations community starts with the knowledge used to inform change. It's important to reframe governance, control, and policy implementation to prioritize the First Nations voice. Disaster planning could stand as an opportunity for more First Nations control of mental health resources and ultimately the local healthcare system. The best examples of disaster recovery for First Nations come from collaborative projects where First Nations leadership prepares for the unique needs of their specific community and allocates resources accordingly. The purpose of this research is to identify possible links between environment and mental and social health in First Nations communities in Canada, to identify mental health resources and programs available for mental health disaster recovery, and to identify community and therapeutic concerns regarding mental and social health related to flood and other disaster recovery in First Nations communities. Review shows most commonly that mental health effects like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety arise after disasters. Other stress-related issues like income stress, maternal stress, and exacerbation of previously existing mental health problems were also common. Less commonly reported, but still prevalent in the literature, were issues like suicide, suicidal ideation, and interpersonal violence. Mental health programs evaluated in the literature have a number of different intervention types for various mental health issues. Most commonly, these include cultural aspects to treatment, whether that's as simple as adapting existing programs for better cultural sensitivity, or an on-the-land intervention meant to reconnect youth with traditions. It's unlikely, however, that a system consisting of only the programs shown in the literature would be able to handle a crisis including the mental health effects listed above, especially considering these programs are meant to address issues that exist already without a disaster involved. The mental health effects of flooding are clear from the disaster literature, but often these effects outlast the end of recovery efforts and fly under the radar for funding and resources available for community recovery after a flood. In situations like the ones experienced by Yellowquill and James Smith, the mental health effects roll over and are exacerbated by the subsequent flooding that happens on an almost yearly basis. Even if the spring melt causes minor basement flooding and mold issues, these events build on top of one another into bad mental health outcomes. This is not by any fault of the communities, but the result of a culmination of marginalization, a history of colonialism, and the changing environment. Some specific common themes have already emerged from my early analysis. Mold and respiratory issues are common in the communities, which can cause stress for those dealing with mold and its health implications. Funding is also a large obstacle, as outside funding is difficult to secure, especially for emergencies. And policy is also a big concern for people. They're hoping in the future that they can have more input and less bureaucracy. Finally, cultural treatment is an interesting theme that arose. Cultural health and cultural mental health care is received in an informal manner as far as programming goes, and usually on a family to elder basis. Despite the negative implications of the results of natural disasters, positive outcomes for disaster planning do exist, involving community control, extensive cooperation between First Nations leadership, governments, and organizations, and integrated programs that prioritize First Nations' right to self-determination. A cooperative and integrative program like this can also act to combat the colonization that marginalizes First Nations people and change the way the policy affects these communities. And thanks for having me. I guess questions are at the end.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Our next speaker. So Don Martin Hill is an associate professor holding the Paul R. McPherson Chair in Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. Dr. Martin Hill does research in the area of social cultural anthropology. Is Professor Martin Hill? Yeah, okay, I will invite you to share your screen.
Sorry, my PowerPoint is froze. I'm going to try, but I think it's still frozen. So I'm going to have to go with a different one. Apologies, I don't know how this is even happening right now. No, it's frozen. I'm wondering if I can go after anyone else till it unfreezes.
Okay, sure, we can try that. So I see a photo, a beautiful photo, but we can wait that it's unfrozen if you prefer. So
It's not, I don't know if you can see my screen.
we can see something, but it's still frozen.
Yeah, it's frozen. Is there another speaker that can go before me?
So in theory, the next speaker is Colin Gibson. If he's ready, I will invite him to share his screen. If he still wants some minutes to get ready, I will also invite the last presenter, Nancy Doubleday, to
yes, we're happy to go.
Okay, great. That's great.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I will introduce the speaker. So Nancy Doubleday is a professor at McMaster University. Dr. Doubleday holds the Hope Chair in Peace and Health. And she co-presents with Nidhi Nagabauta, who is a research fellow and coordinator for the Climate Change and Natural Resources program at the United Nations University.
Thank you very much, Milan. So my colleague, Dr. Nidhi Nagabauta, was with us. I did see her a moment ago, and she's joining us from Belgium. So there are lots of issues for all of us. My sympathies are entirely with Dawn because the uncertainties of the world, the cyber world, are endless. And so what I'm offering today, I have made a PowerPoint. So let's, excuse me, a PDF out of my PowerPoint. And I'm going to do a share screen, but I'm going to try to do it this way first. So let's see if I can get the view. Aha, try that. And then do this, and then do this. Okay, sharing screen. Aha, it did not work the way I wanted it to. There it is. And now expand. Okay, how's that? Is that reasonable? Aha.
That's great.
But it's at the end, so I'll just quickly back up. Okay, thanks so much for including us in this session. Dr. Nagabauta and I are very pleased to have correspondence with anyone who is interested in any of the questions we're going to introduce. And so a shout out to, first of all, our important collaborators, Don Martin Hill, Colin Gibson, who are also part of this session, and to Global Water Futures for supporting the work that they have led on Aneganos and related projects, and also to other funded Global Water Futures initiatives that have supported some of the thinking that Nidhi and I have been able to bring to this presentation. So thank you all for those things. McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands under the protection of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. There's much more to this history, and I do not know it well enough, nor do we have enough time. It's not my prerogative to say more, but I hope that Dawn and Colin will. And so now, on with the presentation. So the premise here is that wherever we are, wherever we're situated, we have some piece of knowledge and understanding, and somehow we need to be more respectful and thoughtful in sharing it, and also making opportunities for other ways of knowing, other understandings, and more importantly, peacemaking activities as we advance change. Because change is sometimes brutal, sometimes uninvited, sometimes welcome, but generally not received the same way by everyone. And so our plea in part is, could we try to enhance our own understanding of interlinkages? If we take responsibility for being the change in the world, and that's not my line, but nonetheless, we could begin to mitigate the surrounding power asymmetries and begin perhaps to address the inequalities, the inequities that we see every day. So we see it in the context of water, obviously, the unequal roles of people and communities in water-related decision-making. And clearly, this is one of the power asymmetries, and this is a problem for governance. And we're not there yet. We're not there in Canada. We're not there globally, but there are a lot of people thinking and working. And so my hope is that a broader conversation may help us. And in that vein, I would like us to also think about those who have been our guides, those who have been able to bring us forward. And by that, I'm now mentioning Dr. Colin Mayfield, who has been a very important figure at UNU Inway, has also been a mentor to many of the generation of researchers who are coming forward now. And so I would just like to give a call out to thinking of those who have gone before us, whoever we are and wherever we stand, because we need to honor the past. We need to respect it, and we need to try our best to appreciate it, even though it may be awful and horrible and difficult. We try. So respecting multiple knowledges, listening as much as speaking, and attempting to share, to understand the privilege that is exercised by many of us, and how that has led and contributed to and perpetuates collateral marginalization of others. These are important things. And so that's kind of the end of the preaching. So on with something more interesting, we hope. So now I'm just going to go down. So I'm playing around with moving my little bar here. So Nidhi and I presented in 2019 with William Stevenson, who was at that time one of my successful undergraduates in a new business program. And so we were at that point very concerned about the need to accelerate the SDGs, because 2030 is very close and there's still an awful lot of work to do. And so if you think about the purposes of the SDGs, and you think about essentially the role of international normativity in shaping our futures. So we have UNDRIP, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We ought to be incorporating values-led thinking when we start to do science, when we start to do integration, when we start to do policy formation. And so that was one of the concerns that we had, but we also saw it was necessary to be more inclusive. And in our academic context, that meant expanding our understanding of what research can do and what it is to embrace and include as many students as possible, to give everyone this opportunity. So we're reaching down into undergrads to do this. And so by this time, having gone through another round of Global Water Futures and many other projects, we do see a lot of change, and we do see a lot of people attempting to deal with emergence, to deal with integration, to do higher order thinking, and to reach across silos. So this is wonderful. This is all very positive. Global Water Futures needs to take a bow, because they certainly have been very valuable in doing this. And also, I would say that we have expanded our previous conceptions of governance, engagement, and equity to some degree. We still have a long way to go, and I hope that we will be moving along more expeditiously. So, for example, we now accept Indigenous leadership in water science. For example, oreganoes. This has not been straightforward and understood from the get-go, but it has come about. And we also now recognize Indigenous knowledge. And this is a battle that I have deep personal familiarity with, and I'm not going to bore you with my life history, but this has been a real struggle. So this is a huge milestone. Thank you, Global Water Futures. Governance is also understood to function through informal as well as formal processes. We heard Dustin Garrick mention this in his plenary at the panel yesterday. So that was great. So Boreal Water Futures, which called for citizen engagement, a national observatory, with citizens as players, not just as recipients, not as observers. So the idea of observatories, we started this, it's been going on for a long, long time. The International Polar Years, the International Geophysical Years, all of the things that have come subsequently, and now Global Water Futures is carrying this forward. So that's another fantastic initiative. Citizen engagement, yes, absolutely. We all know about this. We're all trying to do it to the best of our capacity. And to hear John Pomeroy talk about the Canadian Water Agency in this context, it was brilliant. Just love to hear that. So recognition of social, cultural, ecological systems provides us an opportunity. We can look for convergent processes. We can make spaces for biocultural diversity. And this, now we're going back to the plenary today and thinking about nature-based solutions again. And what we need to think about, and this goes to the plenary yesterday as well, the non-human values, the rights of nature, natural beings, which is the way I'm coming to feel comfortable in talking about them. Mountains, rivers, lakes, trees, all of these things need to be recognized. And so the foundations are strong. Water science community is bigger, stronger. Now what? So the integration problem remains. We did hear a tiny snippet from Dustin Garrick about integration with economic systems and finance. We need to do more thinking about this, in my view. We really have to do that. And I'm going to give a little shout out to Rashid Somala and his project to address the World Trade Organization with adverse, inequitable and inequitous subsidies on fishing. So I'm just going to give a shout out at the end to Rashid. Inclusive engagement, citizen science and beyond, we need to advance our thinking about democratic process and theory and practice in that regard. So legal structures that follow water processes, not just in support of property rights. We have to get beyond those boundaries. As was said by earlier speakers today even, we need to do the transboundary piece. And so Nydia and I are actively engaged in that dialogue as well. Values diversification is really important. If we're going to achieve that notion of nature's beingness and nurturing us, as was said so eloquently by Nadia early this morning, we need to do something about values and the way we think about them. Gaps and needs, past practices have created the following. Now, this is an important reference, and I'm just going to move this bar, because I don't know if you're seeing my bar, it's just me, but a recent piece about transformation and the SDG acceleration process. So this is Clark Lesha from 2021. He wisely detects and flags the path dependencies. Now, this is in part what Dustin was talking about. So the path dependencies created, and I would say created by our choices historically. So where we move away from commons and we embrace private property as a norm, those forces generate the power and financial elitism that we see today. Read Naomi Klein, she's very much more eloquent about this than me. And the pervasive influence of entrenched interests are part of our problem. But on the other hand, we do have some wonderful innovation emerging. We see diverse communities of practice producing these items. I love the robust transdisciplinarity. Even my own institution is talking about this now. We're moving toward rapid adoption and dissemination of innovation. And by inclusion and recognition, so think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, think about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Canada's final endorsement and adoption of this set of important statements and recognitions. And then lastly, again, back to Lesha, the Global Acceleration Framework. I'm rushing a little bit because I forgot to turn my timer on. So past this and into the, where's it going now? Sorry. All right, there. All right. So the goal, virtuous circles. Circles where change feeds positive, valuable resilience, nature, social, cultural resilience, to enfranchise, to diversify, to expand, to include, to transform across the scales, across the conceptual divides. So in methodological terms, we have to do more to bring the qualitative and the quantitative together, in my view. This would make it possible to accelerate our progress, to increase inclusion and cooperation and equity, to transform water governance across scales and boundaries, and to achieve the transformative potential of the SDGs through the help of all peoples, because this is not something for any small elite, regardless of how skilled and brilliant. It's a job for everyone. I'm going to skip over this slide. I can send it to anybody who's interested. And so this is all now doctrine. This, I'm delighted to say, has been pretty much adopted by many, many thinkers. I would like to say thank you. And the last thing I wanted to do was to throw a little shout out in the chat in case someone is interested in taking action. So I'm a great believer in doing things with what we know. There's an opportunity here and I can share more information later. I have no idea if I'm on time, overtime, or under time, but thank you so much for your attention and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doubleday. I'm sure you can talk about this during hours. Our next presenter will be Colin Gibson. So Colin Gibson is a PhD candidate at University of Guelph. His research is studying water resource engineering and international development. He is also a project officer for the Global Water Futures. Colin, I will invite you to share your screen.
Hi, thanks, Mylene. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Colin Gibson, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Guelph, as mentioned, as well as a project officer on the Oneganos research program funded by GWF. Oneganos is a community-led project led by 6 nations of the Grand River and directed under the leadership of Dr. Don Martinhill, who we're going to hear from today. My talk today, really given on behalf of the Oneganos team, is called Striving Towards Reconciliation Through the Co-Creation of Water Research. And I will jump right in. So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce and discuss a new book chapter being published in 2022 called the same name as the presentation, Striving Towards Reconciliation Through the Co-Creation of Water Research. This book chapter was collaboratively written by researchers and community members on the Oneganos team. And through my role as project officer, I had the privilege of being an author and contributing to this piece. If you're interested in reading the chapter, please feel free to follow up and I can let you know when it's released, when we find out. But to best summarize this chapter in an 8-minute talk, I will be focusing on 2 aspects of it with particular emphasis on the second, that is the purpose of the chapter and key highlights from the book chapter. So the main purpose of the book chapter was to discuss reconciliation in environmental research by highlighting Oneganos. This was first accomplished by discussing why reconciliation with Indigenous communities is necessary for natural scientists and engineers. And after introducing reconciliation and further contextualizing it, actionable approaches to reconciliation, described as calls to action, were introduced so they could be used as a reference when discussing Oneganos, demonstrating how reconciliation has been woven into the framework of the research program. Now, I won't get into too much detail about Oneganos outside of that which relates to the highlights being presented in this talk. But for more information, you can visit our website at oneganos.com. And if you've been in different sessions on this conference, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about it as well. And Don will speak as well. So to get into highlights, I'll start with a bit of background, and without going into too much detail, reconciliation within the context of Indigenous people in Canada is a term and concept that is fundamentally tied to making individuals and institutions aware of colonization and the impact it is continually having on Indigenous peoples. But beyond making people aware, reconciliation involves making changes and taking actions to decolonize, prevent, and reverse this legacy. In 2015, to help guide the process of reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released 94 calls to action. However, many of the 94 calls to action developed by the TRC are aimed at governments and institutions and not at the individual. As a result, this can make reconciliation feel elusive on a personal level. In light of this, and because of the harm research can do and has done to many Indigenous communities in their land, a paper was published in 2020 outlining 10 calls to action for natural scientists working in Canada. Published in the journal Facets, this paper titled Towards Reconciliation, 10 Calls to Action for Natural Scientists Working in Canada, outlined the 10 calls to action that helped the Oneganos team describe reconciliation in practice in the book chapter. And here I will very quickly introduce all 10 calls to action outlined by Wong AL. So starting with number 1, we call on natural scientists to understand the socio-political landscape around the research sites, to recognize that generating knowledge about the land is a goal shared with Indigenous peoples, and to seek meaningful relationships and possible collaborations for better outcomes for all involved, to enable knowledge sharing and knowledge co-production, to seek out advice from elders for respectful ways of handling animals, to provide meaningful opportunities for Indigenous community members, particularly youth, to experience and participate in science, to decolonize the landscape, incorporate Indigenous place names as permitted, to take a course on Indigenous history and rights, to call on funding bodies to change approaches to funding, to call on editors of scientific journals to recognize that publication of research on Indigenous knowledge and cultural resources require review and permission from the respective Indigenous communities. And the last one is to develop a new vision for conducting natural science, fundamentally mainstreaming reconciliation in all aspects of the scientific endeavor, from formulation to completion. So again, these are the 10 calls to action laid out by the authors listed above. And they're used as reference in the book chapter. So using these 10 calls to action described in the previous slide, I will now highlight some of what was written about in the book chapter in terms of how reconciliation has been a part of Oneganos research. And starting off with some low-hanging fruit. And these ones are noted as such not because they're necessarily easy, because they might be a little bit more straightforward in terms of the action required. So this would include number 4, seeking out advice from elders for respectful ways of handling animals, which has been done through various research activities, such as those involving GPS turtle tracking and sampling. The Oneganos team has also actually engaged with hunters and trappers to participate in this research, not only getting advice, but learning on the land together. Also number 6, decolonizing the landscape and incorporating Indigenous place names. If anyone was able to attend the Grand River panel yesterday, you would have seen the awesome Terra Stories map being created for 6 Nations by the Oneganos team. This includes place names along the Haldeman Tract and across Haudenosaunee traditional territory. It is actually goal of our mapping facilitator, Chris Martin, to include place names from all Haudenosaunee languages. And lastly, as another more straightforward example, number 7, taking a course on Indigenous history and rights. We've had many students and researchers take the Indigenous Canada Massive Open online course offered by the University of Alberta. But additionally, Oneganos has also developed its own culture and ethics orientation and training program, which includes a 2-hour webinar and provides numerous resources for researchers and partners to access. Now, in addition to describing this low-hanging fruit, I wanted to very briefly talk about a few specific examples relating to some of the more complex calls to action. And that's number 3 and number 5. So for number 3, as a reminder, it was calling on natural scientists to enable knowledge sharing and knowledge co-production. And for Oneganos, an incredibly innovative and successful way in which this has been accomplished has been through Oneganos Let's Talk Water. Let's Talk Water is a live video podcast hosted by Oneganos youth lead Makasha Lookinghorse. And the show brings on guests to discuss a wide range of topics relating to the environment, and guests span from community members to industry professionals, academics, artists, and you name it. It was originally conceived as recourse to the COVID-19 pandemic, as the team needed to continue finding ways to engage with community, disseminate findings, and mobilize knowledge. However, it turned into something so much more, which includes a vehicle for developing relationships and promoting knowledge sharing and co-production. The second piece again, all this mentioned in the panel from yesterday, but in the context of this book chapter, is the virtual reality of the Grand River being developed by Oneganos. Well, it's archive and repository for the research project, Research and Data. It's also a deeply cultural, immersive experience grounded in Indigenous pedagogy and experiential learning, and leveraging state-of-the-art technology. And it's informed and directed by 6 nations, and it's another great example of reconciliation through knowledge sharing and co-production. And call to action number 5, which calls upon natural scientists to provide meaningful opportunities for Indigenous community members to participate, engage in science. I just want to highlight a few points on Oneganos' approach to this call. The first is that Oneganos does not only involve community members, but these community members are heavily relied upon in order to carry out the research program. And so co-creation depends on research partners, participants, community navigators, coordinators, but also the community partners are intellectual contributors, and oftentimes contributions go unrecognized, which creates inequity between non-Indigenous students and Indigenous collaborators. And for this reason, Dawn and the Oneganos team has been working to certify and accredit the amazing work done by Indigenous community members. And that's done through accreditation, various channels of accreditation and certification. And the next aspect I want to mention that relates to this call is it does not, Oneganos recognizes that this call does not limit the definition of science to Western science. It includes Indigenous science, pedagogies, and epistemologies. One way the Oneganos team has sought to create space for Indigenous and Western science to engage with one another has been through Indigenous science contests for schools in and around 6 nations. And the first inaugural Oneganos Science Contest, called the Indigenous Futurism STEAM Symposium, was held in the summer of 2021 and was a major success. Students were partnered with undergrad and grad students, volunteers, as well as researchers to engage in topics supported by Oneganos. So for this call, accreditation and new opportunities for participating in science have both been ways Oneganos has made participation meaningful. And I think I'm just about over time. So I just wanted to end my presentation with a reflection that was made in the chapter. And it was, we discussed a lot about how since co-creation project, since it is a co-creation project, the non-Indigenous researchers have had the incredible privilege of learning about reconciliation and how to work with community members under Indigenous leadership. But while that's been a huge key to Oneganos' success, it's not only co-creation research that should uphold these tenets of reconciliation. And that's noted in the 10th call to action outlined by Wong al, the paper referenced. More must be done to integrate these principles within all science, and in particular, natural scientists working on the land. They also note in the paper that no matter where you are in Canada, you're effectively directly on or immediately adjacent to Indigenous contemporary treaty territory or traditional territory. And this is even more true in the context of water, where watersheds don't reflect political boundaries. So on behalf of the Oneganos team, I encourage all researchers watching this talk to consider how they may engage in and integrate reconciliation to their research, whether working whether currently working directly with an Indigenous community or not. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Colin. Very interesting talk. I will invite Dawn Martin-Hill if she's ready to share her screen. Hopefully the presentation is not frozen anymore.
I think I'm going to be able to do this. And thank you for the invite. And Colin did a great job representing the work that we're doing along with Nancy. So I'm talking about Haudenosaunee pedagogy. Sorry that there's all these, it might be in your way. There's pillars to Haudenosaunee ways of knowing that are community, whether they're here or any of the other 13 Haudenosaunee communities, all rely on heavily to inform and shape our methodologies, our design of any project, whether it's house-based, community-based. We will rely on the following. The creation story provides us with enormous amount of a wealth of teachings about how the earth, how we came to earth and how everything was created. Every animal, every plant, the properties of these plants is all explained in an exceptionally long creation story. So that's where the ecological knowledge is nested. When our people became unhinged, if you will, and forgot their natural responsibilities to the environment and were behaving quite badly about 1,000 years ago, 950 to 1,000 years ago, a divine messenger came to our people. And he brought peace among us. He created 50 leadership positions for women and for men. The women choose their leader, and they had a number of responsibilities, checks and balances, but the natural environment was primary to our existence and our responsibilities. So again, it's not about right, it's about responsibilities. One of the oldest speeches that our kids continue to say every morning at school and when they leave, every ceremony, every event is known as Ganyo. In English, it's the Thanksgiving address. This key, it's not really just a worldview of our people or a frame or a paradigm. It's really a way of life, and it acknowledges all of creation and our responsibility in relationships. And then the newest one would be the Geswenta, which was made with the Dutch in the 1600s, later with the British in the 1700s, which is our basically sovereignty position of self-determination and how we would help our non-native allies at the time. They were allies, and they would help us as we travel the river of life. So these are things that are spoken of quite often. So those shaped the way that we did our research project, and I really didn't know that much about the Sustainable Development Goals, but when I read it, I was like, yeah, we're kind of doing all those things. Women in particular are critical to this project, making sure that youth are involved, making sure that a holistic approach is undertaken. And that's complex and confusing, I know, to my colleagues, particularly the engineers. I like to pick on Colin and Charles, because they just don't know why I'm bringing clinical psychologists on board of a water study. But, I think it's getting clearer to the global community that, there's a significant impact on our well-being. We are the water and the water is us. So if the water's doing poorly, humans are going to do even more poorly. So we understand how important our mental health is and how it's impacted by a declining natural environment that our people have spiritual, cultural relationships with. Unfortunately, Indigenous people have been left out of the whole conservation water studies movement. GWF's done an amazing job, but we've been left out, and I think that's a fact. Until recently, when the number of studies have come out from the United Nations and global assessments, the data speaks for itself. Our people have done an incredible job with no resources, often in conflict zones, but we still manage to take care of our environment far better than anyone else. So, making space for Indigenous people to be in leadership positions is very important if we really want to mitigate any of the climate change crisis that are unfolding almost daily. So we talk about these things in terms of prophecies, and I wanted to bring this up because people get terrified, especially scientists, but it's not a very good word. So that's why language is so important to our culture. It doesn't really translate what we mean. And it has connotations with the Bible and other religions, and we don't have religion. We have spirituality. It's completely different. You can't proselytize or convert people or anything, but in our way of knowing about our world, we were told if you do X, Y is going to happen. And so our elders and leaders from Six Nations have been traveling to the UN since the 70s, begging world leaders to stop their madness because what we're seeing today is going to happen. And they were warning them, and they were using, of course, their knowledge and their ways of knowing to do so. And of course, people didn't listen. But I think today, now that we're near the sixth mass extinction position in the world, there may be some people that are willing to listen. So it seems like we're trying to be heard in important spaces. So Iniganos was a really important vehicle for our people to be able to put data behind their knowledge and what they already knew about the environment and how to do this work. And it starts with the language, and it starts in the land in a cultural framework. And we do collect empirical evidence. We always have had science. It's just that colonialism shut it down for the last 150 years. It's probably only in the last 10 that Indigenous people have been allowed in spaces with PhDs and non-PhDs, but essentially we were locked out of this entire institutional framing of knowledge and science production. We worked really hard to change that, and Oniganos is part of that. Part of the problem with our language is that we are action-oriented language. It's not, there's no such word as chair. There's no objects that you can just describe. Everything is, this is something that you rest on. You know, it's your relationship. It's what humans do with that plant or with that whatever they're describing. So it's about your relationship. So it's so embedded in our way of thinking. It's really hard to engage with people that do not construct their knowledge base that way. That there are things that are just simply objects and there's no relationship to them. So we often don't understand each other, and there's a tension that has always existed between our people and the newcomers. So our women in particular, it seems to be the most interesting space as a Mohawk woman myself, that work with us, particularly the men, you know, that women run this community, and they always have. And I think sometimes it might be a cultural thing where they just not used to meeting mostly 95% of women, because we do the work, and there's a reason that we're in leadership positions. And of course, colonialism tried to diminish that and take away our rights and silence us and make us, you know, property of husbands and all this stuff that our people have resisted for a long time. So women are at the forefront because they're the stewards of water. That's known because they carry babies in water, and there's a connection with the moon, which is our grandmother. So they understood that the sacred relationship that women had. So it made sense that we take care of the water, and essentially the men, the hunters who go into the forest, and the animals, they take care of those spaces. So we've understood our roles and boundaries, and that's really important. The other iconic way in which we refer to knowledge is through the turtle. We call America's Turtle Island because it's in our creation story. We follow the lunar calendar, not the sun, because we're a matrilineal, matriarchal society of women. And life cycles, seasonal cycles, ceremonial cycles, all of these things have to be put in a meaningful space. So no matter what data we're collecting, they're always looking at how is it connected to this one and how is it connected to this one. So they're never compartmentalized. And Western science is very siloed and very compartmentalized, and we have a really tough time operating in that. So there's always a lot of work to do to kind of sort out, you know, they think, well, she's all over the place. I've heard that forever since I was a student. Where in my mind, it's like you can't understand water if you're just looking at this thing. You've got to look at the whole system. So I think it's harder to be in this framework and do this pedagogical practice. It's actually easy to do Western science. Whenever I just decided I was tired and I just want to do Western, stuff, I would get like, I'd kill it, because to me it was so easy compared to what the community would force me to do, which is always really hard. So we're trying to figure out how to represent the work we're doing. And this is what we came up with. We tended to use pictographs. So all of these pictographs are in our stories. They're on walls, rocks, canyons, they're all over the land. And that's how our people left information. And we're able to work together, understanding that you might be working in all of these areas. You're not just going to work on climate change, because climate change is impacting health, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the ways that I think the team has been really great at working with us, and at first really not understanding how we do things, but then trying really hard to do so. So one of the things that in a health project I did was the rites of passage as an intervention to suicide, and it's very effective. We had over 1,000 children. They all were mostly concerned about the water. So that's actually why I ended up with this project. Was a lot of the youth were scared of their future. And so I wanted to do something that would empower them and help them and get to the bottom and see if we can't fix some of the issues, instead of just simply saying, isn't it too bad we can't swim in our river anymore? So that's how the project kind of emerged. But Haudenosaunee people, one of our primacy of being is our children. Everything in the Great Law, every decision that we make, when I go to the chiefs and clan mothers, when I go to council and I ask them to support Oneganos, they don't just say yes. It's kind of a scary, you're always scared when you have to stand before them. And they wanted to know a lot of things, and they wanted to meet the team, and they had to think about it. And because every decision they make, you have to consider, how is this decision going to impact grandchildren, great grandchildren, all the way to 7 generations. My mind can't go there, but I think the leaders do continue to think that way. And that's a pedagogy that's really a metric of excellence that's really hard to know or be. I'm just not smart enough to think 7 generations ahead. So they embraced this project because they thought it was going to improve the well-being for the faces yet to come, is the way it's explained in the language. So when we were looking at mental health, this was a billboard at the school, our immersion school, Gaiwanio, and their Mohawk immersion. And we said, hey, let's use this model and let's begin designing our project according to this, because it speaks to everything, but it's actually our ceremonial cycle, our seasonal cycle. So the kids, this isn't something we created. This was something they created. And we said, can we use it as our wellness model? And so we're elaborating on it, and as we are the turtle, and fixing it to kind of address the issues that we need to address. So for Six Nations people, a lot of the research that's been done by PhD students, Afroza and Sarah Dugnan, who did the health, one with the birthing center, the other was Six Nations Health Services. They developed the questionnaires, they co-created everything from the very beginning right to the implementation. Not so much the analysis, but we're gathering all the analysis because Health Services wants to look at it from a Haudenosaunee lens. Understanding that PhD students need to publish in different journals that may not be as meaningful to people at Six Nations, or they may not know where to find that. Another great study that was done was by Tariq Dean and Atlif Arain, and they did climate change. I'm not going to even attempt to go over this, other than I asked Tariq, and he did great. He presented to our traditional leadership, he presented to our elected leadership, he went on the show, Let's Talk Water. So he's been encouraged to make it as accessible to community understanding as possible, and that's part of the knowledge mobilization. So in the end, I wanted to know, what does all this mean? Because that's what the community's asking me. They already know climate change is upon us. They already know that water insecurity is going to be exacerbated, but they want to know, what does it mean for a growing season? What does it mean for our fishing and harvesting? So I think they needed to understand it from practical terms, and he did do that. I would say, however, that that is something that the youth coordinator who's been interviewing youth over the years has found, that young people in our community are utterly terrified of what's coming around the corner in terms of climate change. They're well aware things are not good. So part of the project that was problematic pedagogically is, how do I release really depressing information to a community that's already has a number of struggles, whether it's land back, whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women. You know, we're already dealing with, you know, recovering bodies of our relatives' children who went to so-called schools. I mean, we're dealing with a lot, and then I'm going to hand them, which is why I asked the clinical psychologist to come and help, because I did not want to do things that were going to exacerbate mental health issues. So what we found overall is that the Six Nations has done a really good job. Our Carolinian forest is still intact. It's the only one intact in Ontario, but our water is in really bad shape. We are encouraging the community not to eat the fish because of the things that have been found. Although we're doing more studies, we're not there yet. I don't know if I'm over time. Can you stop me or tell me?
Yes, I will invite you to conclude now. I think you're 5 minutes over time, so.
Okay, so the maternal health study found, again, anxiety and depression was the highest. The grandmothers were exceptionally high in terms of their mental health. And Sarah's study also found that all residents of Six Nations who are water insecure have high mental health issues. So I'll leave it at there. But thank you so much for having us. And I just wanted to leave it with a picture of my grandchildren, so that, you know, they are the ones that I work for, and that is part of it for our futures. Thank you, Naui.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. We will move on with the 2 minutes lightning talks. We have 5 speakers. First one is Victoria Gavert. Victoria, are you there? Can you share your screen?
Yep, I'm here. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yes, great.
Perfect. Okay, I will share my screen now. Okay, great. Can everyone see my slide?
No, we can't.
Oh, okay.
Do you see the green button, return share screen?
Oh, share.
Yeah. Okay, I see something. Okay, great. We see your screen.
Okay. So I'll just start. So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I'll just start with a little background about the projects that have been happening in Northern Canada. As mentioned before, these biomonitoring clinics were established between 2016 and 2019, so before I started my master's, to collect data related to exposure levels for contaminants in communities in the Northwest Territories and Yukon. So these studies were done in partnership with communities and community leaders. So the research that I'm focusing on involves a specific contaminant called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. These are a type of persistent organic pollutant that can be found in parts of northern Canada because of their persistent nature and long-range transport, even though they're no longer in use or being manufactured. They're able to accumulate in biota and ultimately end up in the food chain and show environmental levels. And environmental monitoring for these persistent organic pollutants in sediment and water systems and fish have been ongoing in the Arctic and subarctic for several years now. So through the previously mentioned biomonitoring clinics, blood samples were collected and then analyzed for PCB levels. So my results here show the lipid adjusted PCB exposure levels in 2 regions, the Decho and the Sahtu in the Northwest Territories, and then one community in Old Crow in the Yukon. So I wanted to look at possible determinants of PCB levels, and I reported the overall PCB levels, and these varied across regions and also between men and women. I also compared these levels to other national biomonitoring projects, and in general, the levels were similar to or lower than the other national exposure levels. But when we look a little deeper and separate out the levels by age groups, certain PCB congeners appeared higher in this biomonitoring study compared to other national biomonitoring studies. So the aim of this study was to fill a sort of data gap in biomonitoring, and can also inform future environmental monitoring efforts. So thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be at the poster session.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Next speaker is Kalin Lazarescu.
Hi, everyone. Hoping everyone can see the screen here and hear me.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So my name is Kalin Lazarescu. I'm a master's student at the University of Waterloo, and today I'll be talking about work on contaminant exposure and lead in northern regions of Canada. So this is work from 2 biomonitoring projects, which have been mentioned now by Milen, Mallory, and Victoria, one which occurred in Old Crow, Yukon, and another in the Decho and Satu regions of the Northwest Territories. Blood and urine samples were collected, and they indicated lead levels were higher than the Canadian Health Measure Survey in both Old Crow and the Satu. So using some additional data that was collected during the projects from things such as food frequency questionnaires, recall surveys, exposure surveys, and just general demographic information, associations with lead were determined. And using the data from all the regions, significant associations were found between smoking and lead levels, with smokers having elevated levels of lead. In Old Crow specifically, associations were found between the consumption of certain animal organs and higher lead levels, the consumption of a daily multivitamin and lower lead levels, and drinking untreated water and increased lead levels, which were all mentioned during Mallory's presentation. On my end, supplemental testing of nutrients in biobanked blood samples from the Satu was completed, and associations were found between various nutrients and lead levels. Specifically, zinc and vitamin D levels were positively associated with lead levels, and this positive correlation is actually not typical. So as a result, an exposure pathway likely exists that causes increased exposure to lead and at the same time is acting as a source of nutrients for zinc and vitamin D. Nutritional analysis did indicate that overall levels of vitamin D were very low in the Satu region, and zinc were slightly lower when compared to national averages. Now, ongoing work is still continuing, and future steps include the implementation of an in-depth exposure survey in the Satu, which was developed alongside research partners and was led by me, and then sampling of various foods and archived food samplings for lead concentrations. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you, Kalin. Next speaker is Vahid Agai.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen and hear my voice.
Yes, we can hear you and see your screen.
Okay, perfect. So I'm a PhD student at the Department of Geography and Planning, University of Saskatchewan, under the supervision of Corinne Schuster-Wallace. And our research title is Adaptive Management of Coupled Human and Water Systems. So these systems exhibit some features associated with complex systems like diversity. So like different actors like farmers, households, governments with different behaviors under similar different circumstances. These systems are resilient, meaning that they can take a hit and withstand it. There are some nonlinear interactions, and like a phenomena cannot be reduced to its individual's properties linearly. These systems evolve through time, they are adaptive, and we can find some emergent properties throughout the system at different scales. So as an example, we proved that when we implement a policy like a cap and trade policy to mitigate groundwater withdrawal, and drawdown, social norms will emerge that are heavily dependent on well monitoring and fine magnitude imposed on violators. And these social norms emerge through time, evolve through time, meaning that or highlighting a policy that is implemented once may not be effective anymore because of these evolutions. And finally, we analyze the literature to see how different coupled systems approaches can account for these complexity features in terms of emergence, resilience, adaptation, and bidirectionality. We concluded that sociohydrology has been highly successful in accounting for complexity, followed by social ecological systems, coupled human and natural systems, water, food, energy nexus, and hydroeconomic coupling. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mehane Gavami.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Good. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we see your screen.
Good. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mehane Gavami. I'm a postdoc fellow at the University of Saskatchewan. My supervisors are Lori Bradford and Lalita Brawaj, and today I'm presenting the summary of our research in this 2-minute lightning talk. So algae blooms or algal blooms are overgrowth of algae in the water. Harmful algal bloom or HAB is a bloom that produces toxins that are dangerous to human, animals, and potentially other organisms. There is increasing evidence that HABs are increasing in number and spread in Canada's lake and waterways, including the prairie provinces. Increased blooms grow risk to human and wildlife health and ecological sustainability. This research aims to assess risks to lake and waterway users from HABs through communication practices. Another goal is to produce culturally harmonized risk communication methods for HABs that benefit First Nation communities. This mixed method study had 127 survey participants and 12 interviews. According to the survey data, receiving text was the most preferred method for communication about HABs. 50% of participants modified their activity as they experienced algal bloom, and roughly the other half had no change in their plans. Interviews with the stakeholders and managers in HABs context in prairies revealed the strategies that were in place to reduce risks. While the communication of the risk of blooms to the public may occur through alerts, social media, email, newsletters, signage, radio, in-person advising, phone, web hosting, or internet, our findings suggest that 73% of people locally do not receive adequate communication about the algal bloom in the province's lake and are not aware of the presence of the blooms and the related health risks. Indigenous participants reported a desire for more communications that align with their cultural beliefs. This study illustrates a baseline level of public knowledge about algal bloom in the prairie waters and recommended better practices for environmental and governmental agencies to monitor, manage, and communicate the risk of HABs to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next and last speaker is Krisha Ducasse.
Great, thank you. I will. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Krisha Ducasse, and I am a data manager at McMaster University. And our poster is a discussion of some progressive best practices to strengthen stewardship and sharing of water science data in Canada. This is based on a paper that was produced by the data management team and a number of researchers. And basically, it was kind of guided by a paper that was put out by Aubrey Wake et al. In 2020, which identified a lot of water science issues in terms of data gaps, barriers to data and discovery, the difficulty in finding long records with data, like water science data, and of course the vast area and limited monitoring throughout Canada. The other aspect of challenges are fair data, OCAP, and all of the different RDM ecosystem structures that are prevalent today, including the move towards open data and journal requirements. So basically, our paper and our poster outline some steps, 10 steps to build data from the active research phase into through publication and legacy to help make your data more available, more standard, and more accessible. So just in terms of the knowledge to action, we have a number of examples where researchers from GWF have worked on data management planning, worked on standardizing in water quality and other types of data, and also shared data through different repositories to help build that accessibility. And our next steps are looking at guidelines for sensitive data, as well as and helping to guide the potential of sharing sensitive data, or at least letting people know that what data has been collected, if not shared, but at least knowing that it's been collected for potential collaborations. And then also an interdisciplinary overlay where we're looking at different domains. And as obviously the ecosystem is more than just water, so we're looking at integrating all of the different aspects. That's been a discussion throughout this meeting, and also, of course, looking at jurisdictional and community practices that can help to bridge some of those barriers to use. So thanks very much for your time. Take care.
So thank you. Thank you to the 11 speakers and all the attendees in this session. We almost finished on time. In this session, we heard about the perception of water, the water and wild foods as determinant of exposure to contaminant. We heard about the importance of engaging with communities and Indigenous nations for improved mental health, as well as better management and governance of water. We learned on how to improve knowledge mobilization and communication of water-related findings. I think also every speaker mentioned partnership, inclusion, engagement, co-creation, co-governance, reconciliation. So I'm glad that we all recognize the importance of those, mainly working with the human dimension of water, and I hope to improve those in the future. So let's continue to do the good work and work collaboratively together with communities and First Nation. That was a very interesting session. Don't forget to look at the posters and feel free to engage with other participants. On this note, I wish you all a good rest of the day and a good conference. Thank you.